I am one of many clergy, spiritual teachers, who together today and over this weekend have agreed to talk about the problem of global warming in our homilies and sermons and Dharma talks. So as you know, those of you who have been here before, this is not a difficult task for me, since I talk about it in most every talk I give. But today, to me, is special because there's a connection. I feel a connection. I feel a family. Many people together this weekend talking about an issue that has been created by the rich and will be given in its most devastating effects to the poor. It's very nice that we're talking about this together. Now, in fact, as we know, these effects have already begun. There has already been death and destruction, and it's continuing today. And I particularly like to talk about this sort of issue at this time of year. I'm very glad that this is happening at this time of year, and I'm very glad that I live in Vermont this year, because this year, as you know, we're having an unusually cold winter. Isn't that fun? It's wonderful to have a cold winter when we talk about the issues of global warming, because one of the most important things in this practice is to get out of our own perspective. Now, this is very difficult for human beings. We have a very hard time getting out of our own perspective. It's one of the reasons that we did the exploration in the meditation today. It's very difficult to get out of our own perspective. And we know this. It's such a wonderful metaphor for our own practice, that human beings, have a very difficult time telling the difference between something that you call weather and something that you call climate. It's very hard for us to tell the difference between those two things. In the same way that it's very difficult for us to tell the difference between the way I see things and the world. We deeply believe that the way I see things is the way things are. It's very hard for us to get out of our own limited perspective. But the purpose of this practice is to get out of our own limited perspective. That, to me, is an excellent definition of what we're doing here. What are we doing here? We're escaping from our own perspective. That's what we're doing. Our goal in sitting, our goal in practicing, is to escape from our own perspective. That's what we're doing. What's our perspective? Well, it doesn't matter in details. What matters is that we're escaping from it. That the next experience we have is not experienced from the same perspective. We are constantly escaping from our own personal, limited way of seeing things. That's what we're doing in this practice. And we just practice doing that. And the practice of seeing the floor again and again, rather than thinking about the fact that I am looking at the floor, that is an absolutely tangible way to practice getting out of our own perspective. To see the floor is getting out of our perspective. To have the idea that I'm seeing the floor is maintaining our own perspective. And that difference, that simple difference, is extremely difficult for human beings to perceive. In the same way that human beings have so much trouble perceiving the difference between weather, for example, that it's unusually cold today, and climate. It's very difficult for us. We think, well, it's awfully cold. So things are getting colder. It's colder today than yesterday, colder here than in other places, therefore things are getting colder. It's very difficult for us to see from a larger perspective than our own. But it's essential that we see from a larger perspective than our own. I'm going to try to convey something that is difficult to convey. I hope that you listen carefully. I guess I'd like to say on this account, I lived in Asia for a long time. Has anyone here ever lived in Asia? Very good. Nepal, anyone else? A little bit? No, not so much. Okay, so in Asia, especially in the Chinese parts of Asia, in the Chinese satellites, Korea and Japan and etc., satellites of the Chinese culture, and in other parts of the world, portions of South America and Africa and other areas, the form of communication that is most common is called receiver-oriented communication. The kind of communication that we use here in the United States and in most of Europe and other parts of the world is called transmitter-oriented communication. So transmitter-oriented communication means that the person who's speaking has the responsibility to convey meaning. So let's say that that I'm speaking to you, and you don't understand what I mean. In our way of looking at it, that's my fault. I wasn't clear. But in Japan and Korea and a lot of other places, it's considered your fault. You didn't listen. So someone has to be given the final responsibility for the transmission of meaning. And the question is, who is that? So for us, it's the person who's speaking. The person who's speaking has to convey the meaning, and that's why we speak in the ways that we speak. Right? We're quite annoying in the way we speak. We yell, and we like to speak. When someone else is speaking, what are we doing? We're thinking of what we're going to say. That's what we're mostly doing. We're not really listening because listening isn't that valued. Speaking is valued for us. Speaking is what matters. And it makes sense that we would mostly be thinking about what am I going to say back? Because that's where our responsibility lies in our culture, in speaking. But over there, it's listening. Listening is where your responsibility lies. And so people don't speak that much there, because that isn't what's most important. People ask a lot of questions. The skill there is in trying to convince the person who's speaking to speak a little more. Would you say a little bit more about that? Let me just ask you a few questions about that, because the person will not be clear automatically since it isn't their job. If they say something and you don't understand, it's your fault. So someone can say something like, what would be a good example? Let's see, how would it be done? What would a good example be? Oh, I know. This is a great example. So someone might be talking, and they might cough. Yes? If you don't get them water, you're in error. They shouldn't ever have to ask you to get them water. You should have noticed. That's your job. It's not their job to ask for water. It's your job to notice that they needed water. If they have to ask you for it, then you already made a mistake. So I'm saying all this to encourage you to now listen. That's what I'm asking you to do. Please listen right now. In Buddhism, we often say, mind is chief. Mind is foremost. Mind leads all things. So now, you should understand all of the implications of what I just said. You should understand how what I just said fully resolves the problem of global warming. And if you don't, it's because you weren't listening. It's that kind of pressure that's put on listening in Asia. You need to really listen. Really, really listen. That's the challenge. So try to hear this. Mind. Mind is the leader. Try to hear what that actually means. So I'll say a little bit more about that. Right now, we human beings, we are destroying life as we know it. We have mostly accomplished that. We have destroyed extraordinary amounts of life on Earth, and we're accelerating in that direction. Why? Let me ask you, are there a lot of people out there who are thinking, you know what I'm going to do? I've got a good idea. I am going to destroy life on Earth. No. There may be no one, actually, who's having that thought. There may be a few, but a negligible number. Those are not the people who are destroying life on Earth. Let's be totally clear on that. The people who are destroying life on Earth are not the people who are thinking, hey, I want to destroy life on Earth. It's very important to see this. That's why it's so important to understand that mind is chief. Mind leads all things. What happens in the world is a reflection of our minds. That's what it is. What happens in the world is a reflection. It's a shadow of our minds, of the state of our minds. ExxonMobil and other petroleum companies are not thinking, you know what we should do? We should destroy life. That's what we should do. That's not what's happening. They're not in board meetings discussing how can we destroy life on this planet. That's not what's happening. It's very important to see this clearly. Because a lot of us, when we want to solve the problem, what do? We get together and say, how can we save life on Earth? But they're very successful at destroying life on Earth. They're not trying to. So why would we believe that by trying to save it, we'd succeed? They're not trying to destroy it, and they're very successful. We're trying to save it, and we're failing miserably. You see this? Because we so much put our egos in front. I am going to do something, without seeing that I am not chief. I am not foremost. I don't lead all things. What does? Mind does. Our state of mind leads all things. The Department of Defense doesn't think, hey, you know what we should do? We should annihilate life as we know it. That's the reason we're going to build all these nuclear weapons. That's not what's happening. They're not thinking that. What is happening? Well, ExxonMobil is a collection of people into an organization that deeply approves of and even cultivates greed. Therefore, life is destroyed. Why? Because mind is chief. And greed is contrary to a natural flow of life. The Department of Defense, what's happening there? It's a bunch of people collected in a culture that approves of, and even cultivates hatred. Deep hatred. Therefore, life is destroyed. Why? Mind is chief. It's very important for us to see this. I'm pointing it out to you, of course, I'm saying it, but if it just is perceived as a bunch of beliefs, then we think that beliefs lead all things. But beliefs don't lead all things. Beliefs are not what I mean when I say mind. Beliefs are just a shadow or an interesting phenomenon that arises within our minds. But there's something else that's being referred to. There's a state of mind that's being referred to. And if we are capable of achieving a selfless, a compassionate, a loving state of mind, then automatically we end up doing things that result in the flourishing of life. It doesn't have to be intentional. It doesn't have to be something that we can later take credit for. We don't later think, oh, look at what I did. I saved life on earth. In the same way that people aren't, we aren't thinking, oh, look at what I did. I destroyed life on earth. We don't mean to. It's just our state of mind that must be reflected in our actions and therefore in our environment. It just has to be, because mind is chief. It's very, very important for us to look at this very carefully. And we can look at it carefully if we take our attention away from circumstances, if we take our attention off of circumstances and put it onto our state of mind. The issue, the source of our behavior, is to a certain extent circumstances, but our reaction to circumstances is far more powerful. Let me give you an example to try to convince you of this extraordinarily important insight. If circumstances were chief, were the thing that controlled our behaviors, then you'd think that wealthy people would give more than poor people, would be more generous. They have more to give. They have less need. You'd think that they would steal less than poor people. You'd think, wouldn't you? You'd think that they would abide by the laws. You don't need to break the laws. You have lots of money. But that's not what we find. Wealthy people are far less generous than poor people. Far less. This isn't an opinion. We have clear statistics on this. Poor people give an average of 7.5% of their income to charity. Rich people give an average of 3.5% of their income to charity. This is a fact. You can argue it if you want, but then you're just wrong. Because it's a fact. There's not an opinion. I'm not saying an opinion. This is a fact. You bring rich people into a laboratory. You bring a bunch of people into a laboratory, ask them to fill out some forms describing their education and their level of wealth and other such things. And then you tell them, you see this jar of candy here. There's a jar of candy here. This jar of candy is for children. There are children down the hall. They're doing a study and we're saving the candy for the children. Don't take any of it. It's not for adults. Yes? And then you have a camera that records who steals candy from that jar. So who steals the candy? The rich people steal the candy. The poor people don't. There's a direct connection between wealth and education. The more wealth you have, the more likely you are to steal that candy. The more education you have, the more likely you are to steal that candy. And again, this is just a fact. You can argue it if you want, but then you're just wrong. Do the study yourself. Try it. If you don't believe it, or just look up the study that was done by professional scientists, if you want. It's very important for us to carefully look at this. And you'd say, well, it's just candy, who cares? But what about, okay, well, then you can ask about crime. What about actual crime? Well, in terms of high-level crime where lots of money is stolen, that's more or less always wealthy people because they're the ones who have the ability to do it. So you say that isn't fair. Poor people can't. They would if they could, but they can't, so they don't. Okay, well, what about shoplifting? Shoplifting candy bars and lighters and such. Who does most of the shoplifting? Rich people. Poor people don't shoplift nearly as much. And so we see that the circumstances aren't in accordance with the data. We see that being wealthy makes people more selfish, less ethical, less empathetic, and more criminal. Isn't that weird? It's not weird. Why? Because mind is chief. The state of mind that we have when we believe we own, we have, I have, this is what I have, that state of mind wins. That's why greed can never be fulfilled. Greed will never be filled. You can never have enough, because the more you have a state of mind of having. And so you have to get more. It's just automatic. The state of mind wins. The more you hate, that hatred can never be ended. We think, oh, it's okay. You killed this person, so I'll just kill you. And it'll end there. It doesn't end there. Mind is chief. It's very important for us to see this absolutely clear. Total clarity. That our state of mind right now, that's what is running everything. That's what's running the show. And the ultimate aspect of our state of mind that's running the show is our sense of identity. Who am I? What am I? That's the most basic aspect of our state of mind. That's the foundational quality. Who am I? What sort of a person am I? Who am I? Am I me? Am I this person? Do I identify with this body, with this mind? If we do, then know that mind is chief. That mind will create behaviors in accordance with that mind. And those behaviors will create a world. And if those behaviors are not given accountability, if we're not given sufficient feedback, for example, if we have power, then we're not given a lot of feedback. And if we don't receive that feedback and get that point of view taken away from us, then it's very dangerous. But if we let go of that identity, if we let go of that state of mind, if we maintain a selfless state of mind in which we're forgetting ourselves, or in which we're constantly identifying with others, I hope that you're happy. I take responsibility for your happiness. If we identify with all living things, if we identify with this earth, if we actually identify with this earth, if we think this earth is what I am this earth, I am this magnificent one life, that's what I am. Now don't think this is not some abstract faraway experience. This is a real experience, which a lot of people in this room have actually had. We have had this experience. It's a real experience. It's not some distant, maybe sort of a thing. This is a real experience that we have actually had. If we maintain that identity, then that state of mind is chief. That state of mind fills us. And our emotions, our thoughts serve that state of mind. And that state of mind, without effort, without needing to become some fight against this or that state of mind automatically produces a world of life, of beauty, of non-conflict. So oftentimes we think, well, what could spirituality have to do, what could all this religious stuff have to do with something like global warming? And the answer is, this is the shortcut. This is the effective way to deal with the problem. That's really how I see it. If we change the way the world functions, the reason that that's useful, and obviously we should do that, if we change the way the world functions, the result of that is actually primarily that it changes the way people's minds are. And then that results in a change. But the change of people's minds is what's important. And that's why we see again and again through human history that transitions, social transitions, the most recent one in our culture and the most celebrated one is the search for the power behind the civil rights movement. That existed for a long time as an economic primarily an economic endeavor, actually. It was to a large extent an economic goal. Slavery was no longer the most useful choice in terms of economics for our country. But then spirituality got involved. And then that didn't make much of a difference. There wasn't a large shift in the way that we functioned. But once spirituality, once religion got involved, that's how we get down to the basis of our minds, of our worldviews. That was the shift. That was the shift in the way we saw the issue. And therefore in the world that we create and support. Now, it doesn't mean that the issue is over, obviously. There's a lot of work to be done. But an enormous amount of work has been done. So please, spend a certain amount of time attending to your state of mind right now. And know that this is the direct path. This is the powerful path. This is the clear path. Please, notice that. Touch mind. Experience your state of mind as a phenomenon of significance. This is the most... To do that is simultaneously an experience of supreme confidence and supreme humility. The two are absolutely unified in that experience. Please give yourself, allow this to take form so that something that's tangible and clear. Do this naturally for ourselves, because that state of mind is one of confidence and humility, which is a state of bliss, a state of extraordinary happiness. And if we, but that's just the beginning. That happiness, if it's maintained as a state of mind, as our baseline state of mind, if we're willing to be happy, if we're actually willing to be happy, that creates a completely new world. A completely new world. Please, give yourself that confidence, that open-heartedness, that willingness to break down, cry, experience the suffering of all the world, to rise up in a state of wonder for the magnificence of life on earth. And know that that selfless state of mind is a tangible and trustworthy guide, a leader in our service to our society and to all living things. I appreciate our practice together because it's this practice, it's this transformation of mind. It gives the power to behave in accordance with the precious nature of life on earth.